We can begin by chanting Om together 5 times. Om, 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 Om. Today is unusual in our sequence of study because we are meeting after a gap of almost 1.5 months. And unfortunately, again next week, I will have to be out of station and we will resume the text of the synthesis of yoga only on the week after, that is 26th of December. So rather than taking the text today and then breaking it again next week, I thought I would share with you some of the interesting learning experiences of my recent trip last month to Japan, and perhaps after that open to some general sharing and discussion as it unfolds. I've spoken earlier of the group Global Peace Initiative of Women. It's a group led by women which brings together people from different traditions to meet and share. It would normally be categorized as interfaith meetings, but these meetings are different in the sense that we don't discuss beliefs of different traditions primarily. Rather, a space is created where people share their experiences. And we find that when we cut through the screens of words, vocabulary, and forms of traditions, and we touch a deeper experience, that there is a natural resonance that emerges, and there is a connection that forms, and a sharing in which we not only learn from each other, but also we grow together. And this is the reason why I always accept whatever invitations come from them. And this time it was for a meeting in Japan. This would probably be the fourth or fifth such meeting. And it was a smaller group this time. Many of them had come before for these gatherings. And our hosts in Japan were a Buddhist group called Shinyo-en. It's a very large group, I believe, with several million members and spreading gradually all over the world. They had chosen themes relating to something which was of special relevance for them. And the themes for the discussion this time were all to do with the title of the session of the whole gathering was Sharing Transformative Spiritual Practices in a Multicultural World. And it was all to do with difficulties that emerge when people from different cultures, different languages, and different traditions come together to share their practices. It was of special relevance for them because of late they have been making an effort to expand their membership in Europe and in America, and they have faced some unusual difficulties which they didn't know how to deal with. So I'll come to that part later. But as with these hosts, as has been in the last few years, they've always made it a point to take all of us first to some unusual places, some special locations where we could get a feel of Japan's spiritual traditions. So in the past, they were temples of the Buddhism or of the Shinto tradition. This time also they had arranged for several such visits. And the most notable, perhaps, of these were the cave where the Shinto tradition originally began and the live volcano, an active volcano, which is also sacred to them. So the first of these was at the cave, and this was a place we were taken through. We could see a cave in a distance across a small valley. We were not allowed to take photos or go close to them. But further nearby was a large cave, and the story goes that at some point the sun goddess hid in the cave because of some misunderstanding. And so the whole world went into darkness, and all the other gods thought of how they could draw her out. And they gathered in this larger cave and they played some music and they danced. And she heard the sound and she came out. And the moment she came out to look, they captured her and brought her out. And this is the origin of the whole Shinto lineage because her her children and their grandchildren became then the origin of the royal lineage of Japan. So it's a very interesting story which connects the human dynasty with divine origins. We find similar stories in many traditions of the world, and there are two ways of looking at them. One is a purely spiritual perspective, which is that at certain periods in human history, there is a special descent of a divine presence, which may even take a material form as a materialization to guide human beings, or it may act through a human vehicle, as was the case in certain traditions of the oracle, or they took birth, as in a case of an avatar or a vibhuti, in a human body, and so began through them a human connection and a human progeny. This would be the spiritual perspective. There is also a more material perspective which is popular among some circles, that beings from other civilizations from elsewhere came to Earth and interacted with human beings, and that led to uh, a new a change in the human consciousness and in the human genetics and so on. Whatever the specific case in this, what was interesting was this space was highly revered, and throughout the large cave, we found piles of little stones, which were prayers put by people who come and visit there. I couldn't find one single loose stone. All the stones had been gathered and put in these little piles. And as in most Shinto temples, we found in the temple next to it, we found that there is no idol, there is no obvious symbol. There is in the center a mirror. So when we had first seen a mirror in the place of the idol, some of us were given to understand that it represented seeing yourself, or the divine is in yourself, or you are in the divine, or some kind of an identity of the human with the divine. But this time we asked the priest, what does the mirror represent? And he gave a very different understanding. He said, the mirror is like a gateway, it's like an opening to the inner worlds. So it was not so much a reflection of oneself, rather, it was an entry point to another reality. And then it struck me that in practically all occult traditions, there is this practice of looking at either the future or the past or of things in another world through a mirror, using the mirror as a symbol. There is a special term for it which escapes my mind now. But in many variations of this, a mirror is taken, generally it is sanctified, and then the person working with the mirror either does a certain invocation or a concentration, and then he stares into the mirror, not so much looking at his own reflection, but at the thing behind. It's as if he concentrates on the world behind, and gradually, as his concentration deepens, he begins to see images, forms of the subtler worlds. Sometimes there is a variation where the mirror is placed in running water, or the mirror is replaced by running water itself, and you stare in the water to see, look into those worlds. In certain practices, even the thumbnail is used for a similar purpose. Of course, in the most advanced, you do not need any physical device. You simply look directly with the clairvoyant sight and you see what you need to see. But it was interesting to see the mirror used in the Shinto temple as a gateway. Uh, so this was a new experience for us, although we had been to other Shinto temples before. Separate from this, we were taken to a live volcano, and there was a museum associated with it. It was Mount Aso, and we were taken to a hotel nearby, which was in the center of the whole volcanic space. It is called a caldera, and they say that this was a huge volcano before, which exploded many million years ago, and the whole area is surrounded by hills, like a big circle, and all of this is volcanic soil, very fertile. But in the center of it, there is still a live volcano, which is Mount Aso, and it is a sacred mountain to the Shinto tradition. It still continues to spew steam continuously, 24 hours. And we went very close to it, barely about 2 kilometers from the center, where they had a museum. And we were shown how they are monitoring the volcano. There was a live feed of a video camera. And then we saw a picture of all the volcanoes of the world. And out of all of them, there are about, I'm not sure of the exact number, but 1,300 or so. Out of all of them, 110 are in Japan. That is 1/10 of all the world's volcanoes, active volcanoes, are in Japan proper, which makes it a very special place volcanically. And we asked the person, the head of the director of the museum, what's the likelihood that it will erupt? And he said, oh, it can happen anytime. It can happen even now. No warnings at all. And as it did erupt a week later, in fact. But at that point, we were all talking amongst ourselves that so far, whenever we have had these spiritual gatherings in unusual places, there has always been some after effect, not always the way we would want it. For example, when we had a gathering in Africa, we had more than 100 people who had gathered. It was in the middle of a large reserve. A week or two later, there was a massive fire which lasted several weeks. They could not control it. And soon after, a large massacre of elephants. And we were wondering whether it had to do something with our own prayers there, because we had a whole group, more than 100 people, who had sat there doing certain prayers, and the head of the Shinyoin tradition had done a fire ceremony in Africa. And we had the African uh, medicine men and chiefs who had participated in that ceremony. So it was a very special gathering. A very special presence had been felt. And soon after, there was this big fire. Similarly, we had a meeting in South Korea and a meditation on the border in the demilitarized zone between North and South, where we prayed for peace between North and South. And a week later, there was some major altercation and conflict. So we were just discussing this and we said, oh, perhaps when we leave here, the volcano might just erupt. And it did a week later. And we were wondering, perhaps it happens that when there is a strong spiritual influx, there is often a reaction from the material consciousness, or perhaps it destabilizes something and leads to such physical effects. But it was not a surprise for many of us. Although we had a good laugh, we made a joke that hereafter many of these places will write to GPIW and say, please do your programs elsewhere and not at our location. You know, we were not allowed to go close to the edge of the mountain because it was already spewing strong acidic steam. But otherwise, normally people are allowed to go all the way to the edge. There were small earthquakes even when we were near it. I, on my own and many of us, we were trying to feel the sense of that space, what it means to be before a volcano and to look upon it as a sacred presence. And it was an unusual experience in that sense. We were also taken to a place where there was water emerging from the ground, natural springs emerging from below the soil, and it was also considered a holy uh, center for the Shinto tradition. The water was so pure you could drink from it, and it was, of course, said to give special health benefits. But it was so clear and it was so well maintained, and I think we were told 24 spots from which the water was gushing out from below the soil. So there were a few such special locations that we were taken to. And then finally our gathering started. We had some themes. One of the first sessions we had to do with contemplative practice as a means of social transformation. And there were many discussions going on in that. The question is of whether a contemplative spiritual tradition can, should engage with social transformation, and if so, how? And of course, there are many possibilities here. The question was asked by somebody, and that became a trigger for a very deep discussion. The question was asked, when exactly does spiritual practice lead to transformation? Because one can do many spiritual practices, gain many spiritual benefits, even liberative experiences, but they may not be transformative. And the transformation may be personal, it may not be social, collective. And that triggered a line of discussion. And I tried to orient that discussion using this idea that when we first begin a spiritual practice, the first focus is always ourselves, our own consciousness, and a deepening or a heightening of our focal point of consciousness. One could, in principle, go deeper and deeper and deeper, disengaging from the whole world until eventually one reaches some high peak, some absolute into which one may dissolve or with which one may enter in relation and stay. But in this case, there is no transformation. There is only a liberation of consciousness. It is only when this heightened, deepened, or liberated consciousness now chooses to engage with the world and tries to articulate itself, express itself, or act in the world, that it faces a problem. The instruments through which it has to act are still exactly the same way they were. The body is still the same, the life energies, the instincts, the drives, the motivations, the mind, everything is exactly the same. Only your consciousness disengaged from all that into some great freedom. But when you have to engage with the world, you have to use exactly the same raw material as it was, crude, coarse, unrefined, undeveloped. And that's when you find your own means are insufficient, even that they distort what is attempted to be expressed. And that's when one finds oneself compelled to change this material, and the effort of transformation begins. So, in brief, a spiritual practice becomes transformative when it has to engage with the world. If it doesn't have to engage with the world, it need not be and generally is not transformative. This is a very interesting thing now. When we choose to engage, there is a practical problem. If you engage too soon, then you're engaging with the world with an insufficiently liberated consciousness. Your actions will be, to that extent, even ineffective, even distorted, exaggerated, even perhaps. On the other hand, if you go too deep and then seek to engage, you have so distanced yourself that you are unable to deal with the world or even your own instruments because they become alien to you. You're uncomfortable, you don't belong anymore to this. And so there is a practical problem. And the conclusion which we came to, and which was highlighted also by the Sufi participants, they said in their tradition, with each step inward, you have to engage with the world. And this is exactly the approach that we would take in the integral yoga. At every moment, we have to engage. And the mother made this observation that it does not matter what you experience during your meditations. What matters is how it changes your life, in life. So that engagement with the world is the measure of the inner development. Otherwise, she said, we can have many profound and beautiful experiences, but they will remain subjective. They will not lead to any change in life. And without that change, we have not really fulfilled the spiritual purpose. So, this bridging of the inner and the outer and the higher and the lower and so on begins to take place only when we accept that we have to engage with the world. Those who choose not to engage, well, wouldn't be part of that gathering in any case. So, at least for those people seated there, now engagement was the theme of our further discussion. We were then taken to one more place before the rest of the discussion continued, where they told us, look, this is not a spiritual sacred site, but it is still something of Japanese culture. And this was a samurai fortress. And we went to that place. It looked quite grand from outside, multi-storied structure. We were taken through a museum first, which was very beautiful, and then into the main part of the fortress. I went up barely one floor and I began to have a severe headache. And it was not good vibes at all. I suppose it was a place of great conflict and pain and struggles. And other people also in our group were feeling uncomfortable. And so those of us who couldn't stand it, we came out and we just sat outside. But others who were more adventurous, they made it all the way to the top. But I've seen this problem in many places, in many old forts. Although one may look upon them as cultural sites, in terms of quality of consciousness imprinted there, they are often very difficult to handle. In many of the old forts, in the dungeons, they had some of the worst vibrations because people were jailed there, often for years in the most miserable conditions. And that spreads to fill all these places. And one wonders if these were seats of power and if rulers lived there, what kind of consciousness would be constantly impressing upon them, and how it would affect their behavior and even their rule of the space around. Yes, it's a very difficult thing to consider. And this is the reason why, in my opinion, there was a period, a passage in which many of these places were destroyed. Sometimes through barbaric invasions, sometimes through wars, sometimes through other means. But many of them had to be destroyed simply because they were not good places, and unless the thing gathered there was dissolved, there was not an opportunity for rebuilding of something new. So this is just a passing incident. We moved on from there to the Shinyo-en's special retreat house, which is built in the traditional Japanese style, and it is supposed to be one of the masterpieces of modern Japan. There is the traditional Japanese garden around, and then the house, which is maintained exactly in the Japanese style. Oh, but just before that, we also went to a Zen temple, Zen monastery, where we saw the Zen garden and the space where the room where one of the founders of the Zen tradition lived. And it had a very special atmosphere. It was quite unusual to be in that space. All the things he had used several hundred years ago were still kept intact, and the whole thing was preserved. And there was a special presence for sure. We felt that we all felt something special there. So then we came to this place where the main retreat house was there, and we had a discussion on sharing practices for spiritual development. And one of the points of discussion was when we were speaking of different types of practices, I tried to highlight that among all these practices of different traditions, rather than looking at a specific form of practice and the result that it gives, we need to go back one step to the principle behind the practice which makes it effective. And I pointed out that very often you will see when you have all the traditions and practices of the different traditions together, two very different practices lead to the same result, or the same practice in two different traditions are intended to lead to very different results. And how does one explain that? We have a way of thinking in the modern mind, and largely this comes from the scientific training, that spiritual practices are like a formula. You take hydrogen, you take oxygen, you mix the two and trigger it with a spark, and you will get water. Here's a fixed formula, H2O, and you get this result. Arrange these liquids, mix them in this way, push it in that way, compress them, heat them, you will get this outcome. And we tend to project the same kind of mindset into the occult and spiritual domain, which is not valid, because the domains of the occult and spiritual are much more fluid and plastic. They are also inherently more profound. While physics is in the domain of form and of rigidity of form and relationships, because it is matter, psychology is already at a level which is not primarily form, which has a greater fluidity and therefore also more complex pulls and pushes of energies and forces. But when you go still behind, still deeper to an occult dimension or even a spiritual dimension, then it becomes even more plastic, even more free of form. And in fact, entering those deep dimensions directly, as in deep meditation, a beginner is often lost because he loses reference of forms. You're in a world of pure energy, pure consciousness, quality of experience, which is inherently formless. And since we're still by habit used to attaching ourselves to form, we tend to translate those states into forms. And this is what leads to symbolic representations, images, visual scenes, and so on, which then we struggle to interpret because now you've reduced something more profound to only a form, and then you have to struggle to make sense of the form. So, especially when we deal with spiritual practices and they are meant to begin as a form and end in something which is formless, essential consciousness change, then we need to look at the thing behind which makes it effective. And obviously, the thing which makes it effective is not the specifics of the form. Because an exercise in matter and a form of matter, material process, cannot in itself produce a spiritual shift. If that were the case, then you would obviously find some injection, some chemical which you could inject in the bloodstream to attain self realization, because self realization would be a product of a material process. So, obviously, when you do a spiritual practice, use a technique, use a form of practice or meditation, the thing which makes it effective is not in the domain of the form. And so I highlighted this the importance of going back to something behind to the principles, and they're all psychological or spiritual principles. And this led to some discussion and also some differences with certain traditions. I made this comment, which I don't know if it was too strong to make. I said, if a tradition defines itself purely in terms of its forms, it is doomed to dissolution. Because after all, the spirituality will not be in its forms but in its spirit. And that's why the forms are necessarily recast in time. So we had some discussion around this, and there were some traditions which were uncomfortable with this. And we had also Swami Atmarupananda from the Ramakrishna mission, who simply said, yes, that is a point of difference. He put it this way: look, in the yogic tradition, we believe that we do not find ourselves bound to any specific form, that we are able to use forms and discard forms because there is something behind which is more fundamental, more essential. And so forms are helpful, in fact extremely helpful, but we are not necessarily bound to them, and that's a point of difference, and so we left it at that. But I thought the content of the discussion was of importance because this is really at the root of all conflict between the different spiritual and religious traditions of the world and even their practices. I've seen many books, teachings which give you a formula: do this and you get this result. And the point which would come from the integral yoga approach is that what makes it effective is the intention that you have put behind it. I gave this example of the yogasanas and pranayam. I said in the original objective of Hatha Yoga, you did asanas and pranayam as a way of first purifying the body consciousness and then bringing into it a huge amount of life energy so that this would lead eventually to the liberation of the Kundalini and the liberation of consciousness and spiritual realization. Now, all of this is thrown out in the modern use of asanas and pranayam in the modern yoga studio, where all you're doing is, as they said it in New York, you're focused on getting the yoga butt. Because you want to shape your body to make it look more streamlined, more elegant, as an exercise only. So the point being, when you do the asanas with that intention, you will get that result. You will get your yoga butt. But if you do the same asanas with the intention of bringing a certain stillness in the nerves and the body, to infuse in it a greater life force and even a spiritual energy, well, that's the result you will get. So the intention behind is much more important. Where you put your concentration, what is the objective with which you do it? And to take it further as a discussion, sometimes you may not have a conscious intention. I go and do my asanas 20 minutes a week, a day, or whatever it is. I'm busy doing it with the whole group. My mind is wandering somewhere else. But implied in the whole exercise was an intention with which I chose to join it to begin with. And that intention works. And even if my intention is not strong enough, the intention of the group works. Or most effectively, the intention of the person who leads the group has a huge impact on the result. Now, this is a dimension which is not well known. I'm going to put it in a more general way like this. In any group interaction, the person who holds power over the group and the interaction, his state of consciousness and his intention will have a huge impact on the whole group consciousness and its result. Now, this is as simple as a normal classroom in any school, where a teacher is in charge and the quality of consciousness, state of mind of the teacher is going to impact the students and what comes into the classroom, irrespective of what subject and what textbook is being followed. And then the principal of the school, who now wields power over all these interactions, his or her state of consciousness will impact the whole. And so this is an occult dimension which most people do not take into consideration consciously. But still, the point being, this acts as the intention which drives the outcome. If the person who leads the asanas class is focused on a spiritual transformation, that impact will come on the whole group, even if they're busy just trying to shape their bodies. There will be a result on them. So this is the importance of intention and the importance of principles behind the forms. And then I concluded this discussion by saying that while there are many principles operative in any process which make it effective, there are three principles which are at the heart of all, which make all practices effective more or less. And these three are: first, the aspiration, this intention with which you take up the practice, the goal that you set for yourself, the way you gather and concentrate your energies towards the fulfillment of that goal. This is the single most important determining factor. Second is the principle of rejection, the conscious removal of all that is contrary to the aspiration, the conscious elimination of all influences which disturb, deflect, or confuse the primary objective with which you have begun your practice. So, the conscious removal of the opposite. And the third is the principle of self surrender. We are all familiar with this, of course, from Sri Aurobido's writing. But the idea here is, because in the spiritual practice we aim to get to something which is not ourselves, which is not only not ourselves but greater than ourselves, not only greater but transcending us. Therefore, there is no way we can get to it only by our own effort, because that is not a product of what we are. We are a derivation of that. And therefore, the only way you can get to something which is transcending all that you are is by submitting to it and allowing it to fill you, to gather you, to raise you, transform you, and so on. So these are the three principles which together make any practice effective, and you will see how Sri Aurobindo, of course, develops it. But I pointed out that these three apply in any kind of training for any objective, whether it is a school student trying to acquire some new capacity or knowledge in a school classroom context, or whether it is on an Olympic gymnast who is trying to develop, push the body to limits which are beyond his current capacity, or a spiritual seeker aiming to realize something greater than himself. Whatever it is, these three principles would apply everywhere. We had another very interesting discussion. The theme was the secularization of spiritual practices. This is about how increasingly very profound spiritual practices are being taken and secularized for the general public. And the question was, To what extent can the esoteric side of spiritual practices be shared publicly without losing their spiritual power? On the other hand, is it necessary that we have to dilute in order that the maximum number of people can receive something? And is it self defeating to water down the practices to make them accessible to all? My own view on this was I'll summarize in this way. I said, first, that we are at a point of crisis in human evolution where time is short. We don't have the luxury of another 100 years or 200 years in which to make a transition. If we do not change now, we are very likely to destroy ourselves within the generation itself in every possible way. We don't need to elaborate here. Everything from poisoning our environment to uh, dehumanizing our culture and our children and everything else. And so there is an urgency. There is a need to reach out to the largest group possible, to put out there the means and the tools for developing our consciousness and to place before people a greater ideal for life. And if in doing so there is a dilution and a loss in the way it touches the general public, that is a price you pay for the opportunity of perhaps being able to make a breakthrough and save this human condition. On the other side, there are always those who are deeply committed and who will maintain the purity and intensity and the deeper dimension of these teachings or their practices. So, as I see it, any action which ends up in removing veils and helping people to wake up is worthwhile. Anything which assists in increasing those veils is damaging. As a very general statement, we can take this as a guideline. And then I said, as far as our group is concerned, I said, it's extremely important that we do not dilute our own traditions, our ideals, practices, or the consciousness. There are enough people out there who are doing the dilution and the work of sharing through dilution. Humanity doesn't need more of them. Humanity lacks enough people who have this intense, deep commitment. And so, whoever has that should focus on deepening and strengthening that. There was another interesting theme was the joining of multiple traditions. What's happening is that a lot of people are jumping between traditions, between different practices increasingly. So there is somebody who will say something like, I was born a Catholic, but I felt myself drawn to Buddhism, and then I practiced a little bit of Zen meditation, and then I took up some other Vedantic practices, and now I am a Sufi. You may go through a whole circuit, and somewhere along the way, you've picked up things which never leave you. The journey itself is interesting. One may, of course, look at it from the highest standpoint that since the new step in evolution is intended to be one of a unifying consciousness, a supramental consciousness, then obviously there will be in nature this instinct to lead people through a unifying experience and to a unifying experience. And this may take practically such forms. But the question still remains that it may prevent people from going deeper into the tradition, lead to some kind of a homogenization, loss of diversity perhaps, or some kind of superficialization of these things. Many who are in the more orthodox side of their own tradition are uncomfortable because it leads to a mixture and a general mishmash. So What came out in that discussion was there is a need to deepen each tradition. But somebody made a very interesting observation. There is also a need to widen each of the traditions. So far people only have been speaking of deepening your own tradition, deepening your own practice, going to some mystical depth and spiritual experience, not stopping at superficialities of the tradition. But it was the first time I heard someone speak of widening your own tradition. I'm not sure how many people would be comfortable with that, especially the orthodoxy of those traditions. But certainly, this is in fact a requirement. And it was interesting to see many people in our group had themselves been through multiple experiences of multiple traditions, and they had a wideness, whereas those who had not been through that had tended to have a narrowness in their views. Then the last session was about teaching spiritual practices in a multicultural setting. So when one tradition moves to a different cultural space, it often experiences a struggle because of very different values, different mindsets. Now, for example, the Shinyoen group, being a Japanese Buddhist tradition, tracing its tradition back all the way to Tibet, it is very hierarchical because of the Japanese cultural imprint. It is also very ceremonial because of its Tibetan influence. And they found that when they go to certain spaces in Europe or in America, they found people don't like that kind of ceremonialism and they don't like the hierarchy. They feel it suffocating. Now, if you look at the problem itself, it has nothing to do with the essential teaching. It has more to do with the form of the tradition. But this is a real problem we face because in humanity there is such a large diversity of mindsets and values that come with those mindsets. So I tried to bring something, this idea here, that when we consider a problem like this, none of us can fully appreciate the difficulty of this problem because all of us have grown up in a certain culture and its associated mindset. If we are lucky in our lifetime, we may begin to understand the mindset and values of another culture more deeply. And very few have insight, deeper insight into more than one culture generally. You may see superficialities of form, like when Americans travel to Japan, there is a whole sheet of bullet points. In Japan, do not do this, 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 do this, 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 because this is what they believe, this is what they practice. Similarly, the Japanese will be told when you go to Europe, do this and don't do that. Now, generally, when such a thing takes place, we have not really understood the other culture. We have just accepted, oh, they are weird. They do it in a strange way, okay, we will adapt to it. But that's not really understanding. It's in fact very difficult to understand truly, and you do not understand unless you can enter into their mindset and experience it from within them and see why it is so true to them to live in that way, to follow those forms, and feel it as your own because it's so vivid, it's so real, it's so true. That looking from there at your own inborn practices and mindset, you'll say, oh, that's alien. That's when you really understand another culture. That's difficult to do. It can only be done by a certain yogic skill of identification and consciousness. Of course, there are degrees through which one can begin the process. But this is really the problem. And I tried to make a few notes about how different these can be. There are mindsets which are black and white. The whole culture is used to thinking in terms of yes or no. It's either this or that. And then there are cultures which are used to grays. They are uncomfortable with black and white because they see everything as part of a continuity. So if you tell me this is wrong and that is right, this person will feel extremely uncomfortable because that's not true. This is mostly wrong, but there's a grain of truth in it, and that is mostly right, but there are some errors in it. And there is a continuity of grays across everything. There is nothing which is wholly black or wholly white, wholly right or wholly wrong, etc. Even objects do not stand out as separate. They're all part of a continuum, of a context, without which they have no relevance. If you take, very simply, a mobile phone, yes, of course, it has a meaning for all of us. We know what it does. But take it out of its context. And what is the context here? It's not visible. It's these transmitting towers all around for the mobile network. Take it out of its context, and it's just a piece of plastic and metal. It has no value, isn't it? Though the context is not obvious, it is invisible, but still, it is the context which makes it a mobile phone. Take it out of the context, and it is nothing. A brick in the wrong place is no better than a stone. In the right place, it is holding up a whole construction of a building. So it is there's a mindset in which everything is seen in relation to context. We had this discussion with Tioka Sin, a Native American sun dancer from the Lakota tradition, about whom I had mentioned on another occasion. And he told us this. He said, when the Europeans first arrived in America, he said his ancestors were surprised at how much they saw the world in separate pieces. Whereas in their culture, everything was seen as part of a continuity and as part of a context. And it was for them, it took them a hard time to begin to understand that there could be a culture that saw things as separate and as made up of pieces. So, this is one example of how radically different the mindset can be. There are also equally mindsets which are fluid. They can easily adapt, they can easily shift perspective, move around, even change their own thinking if they decide to change. And then there are mindsets which are stiff, they don't adapt easily, they're stuck in whatever habit they have. And it's a struggle even to change. Even the idea that you can change your own viewpoint is alien for many. And then there are languages in which words have a fixed meaning. Most of the modern languages are like that, English in particular. You have a dictionary. This word means this. Okay, at best, this word means this and this and this and this. But each of the associations is a fixed connection. Now, we would assume that all languages are like that if we were brought up in an English mindset. But in reality, if you go to any of the old languages, this word means this, a whole spread of meanings. Especially when you look at a Sanskrit dictionary. Just one letter, K, goes for 3 pages. What kind of a dictionary is this? It's not a point to point, word to thought, word to form, idea association. It's a whole spread of many different suggestions, ideas, fluid directions of experience. And so when you have a word also similarly, a simple word, for in a Sanskrit dictionary, may have a whole set of, going back 2 or 3 columns. And it's not that the the language is more difficult. It's that by nature the language is not fixed associations of meanings. It is layered, multifaceted and multi-layered. And so a word can modify its meaning in context with other words, and all of those variations are implied, though one is highlighted in the context. And this already, when you begin to grow up in a language like that, you end up also with a more multi-layered, multifaceted way of thinking. So it's possible that a mind which is so used to being like this, as it listens to somebody speak in a conventional English language, he will understand much more what the person means than just what he says. So in any discussion, you would say, yes, this is what you mean. And the translator would just translate into whatever language it is they're going to. But the person who's listening in from this multifaceted, multi-layered mind will say, oh, you mean this, and all of this together. But that's what is in the person when you speak. And the language is narrowing and reducing all the rich experience which you hold within you and putting a very thin thread which conveys a very narrow band of all that is inside. But on the other side, the person can still catch through that one link all the rest which has not been articulated. So, the point being, of course, that even spiritual traditions therefore reflect this either fixed structures or multifaceted, multi-layered dimensions. Then again, there are mindsets which are inclusive, mindsets which are exclusive, mindsets which look at things from in to out, mindsets which look at things from out to in. I came across a very interesting example. I don't know if I mentioned it last time. This was told to me by a Sanskrit teacher. She said, in Sanskrit, there is no way of saying this is mine because the idea of my possession does not exist. This is with me temporarily. Implied is the idea temporarily. Right now, this is with me, and implied is the idea that tomorrow it may be with someone else. Yesterday it was with someone else. Everything has is part of a whole in which it moves around. But the idea that I exclusively possess and own this, that idea does not actually exist, and there's no way the language allows you to articulate something like this. It's a very interesting way of looking at it, that the cultural and even the spiritual values mold the language, and the language perpetuates those values. That's why when you have to translate from one culture to another, these are some of the struggles which you will face. Also, this idea of looking at things in to out or out to in. Again, it's a very interesting approach. A more intuitive mind will tend to see things in to out, whereas a more physical mind would tend to see things out to in. So let's say we all gather around an elephant. The one with a physical mind will say, oh, here is an elephant, a word, an idea. It's an animal. It needs this, it needs that. Be careful of the tail, be careful of the leg. Oh, he might hit you with his trunk. It stops there. Whereas the intuitive mind will immediately connect with the person, the being that is the elephant. Oh, he's so sweet, he's so gentle. And then from inside out, you will begin to describe this being. And we see this among people, even within a single culture, there are those who are more in the physical mind, those who are more in the intuitive, and it makes a huge difference. There's a lot of this reductionism when they make statements like men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and things like that. I don't think it has to do with a completely different way of looking at things in this case. It has much more to do with being able to feel and connect on an emotional level. Can you feel a person first, or are you stuck with appearances and forms? And it is not really bound so much to uh, gender, it has to do much more with sensitivity and refinement of sensitivity. I also pointed out how there are certain words and concepts which do not jump across easily across cultures. For example, we all use the word God. Whatever the tradition it is, you have some equivalent term for God. But what we mean by that term is very different. So the Buddhists will say, no God. But they have the absolute. And if from the Vedantic tradition you said Brahman and translated Brahman as God, then it would conflict with Buddhism. But if you translated Brahman as absolute, then it would be completely identical with Buddhism. So the problem is in this translation of the word, and that has led to so much confusion because everybody has translated into English, and then we're talking now in English. And we're using words which are not of our original concepts, and we have not really translated the concept suitably. So, one example which we have is this enlightenment. From the Buddhist tradition, they all translating into English, they use the word enlightenment. So I met somebody once in America, and he said, I am enlightened. One day I woke up and I was enlightened, and I belong to the Raman Maharshi tradition because Raman Maharshi was also self-enlightened. I am also self-enlightened. Okay. So after listening a bit, I asked him, but do you understand the difference between enlightenment that you mean and self-realization? He said, no, what's the difference? I explained to him a little bit, and he said, oh, okay, see, that's interesting. That's the advantage of having a proper tradition. It explains all these things. But he still didn't get the point that he could not compare himself with Raman Maharshi just because he had some light, some illumination of some kind. And of course, there's so many illuminations and illuminations of different grades. So the problem with this word enlightened in English is that it is not defined. So the Buddhist will say Buddha attained enlightenment, and here's a man who can say I was eating hamburger and I attained enlightenment, but they mean totally different things. So this was one of the problems which we had discussed: enlightenment versus liberation and self-realization. Dharma was another concept which had a hard time being translated. So, in fact, in the yogic tradition, we have so many words: Ishwar, Bhagwan, Purusha, Brahman, Narayana, Tat. Now, all of these are translated loosely as God, because in English you have no word to describe all of these different experiences or facets. But in the Sanskrit, they all have very distinct and different meanings. They all may be approaches to that, the same one, but they highlight different aspects of the relationship or of what you are referring to. My favorite example, of course, which I didn't mention there, is this English, the word in English for love. And I love ice cream. I love my dog. I love to fly a kite. I love you. And they're all very different experiences, all of which are crushed into one word, love. And so when a teenager has a strong crush and says, I am in love, they mean something very different from somebody else who may say the same words in a different context. And the problem is because it's one word, we all end up thinking we're dealing with one experience which is so complicated and so confusing. No, it's not. They're all many different experiences. So let's find different labels for them. Yes, in Sanskrit, I'm sure there are about 20. There are about 20 words, perhaps, catching these very distinct facets. I'm told in the Eskimo language there are 50 different words for snow. And why is that? Because for them it makes a difference whether this is this kind of snow or that kind of snow. It's part of their reality of life. So they have a vocabulary for it. And so it's often a reflection of the culture and its values, what kind of vocabulary develops and what it does, what words it develops to express itself. Sometimes when people ask me, what language do you speak at home? My answer is a little complicated. I speak three languages. When I have to express something involving a lot of affection and care, then I will speak in Marathi. When I have to converse in a normal day to day function, I will speak in Hindi. But when I have to argue, I'll switch to English. Because as a language, English does not have a rich vocabulary for emotions and deeper sentiments, but it has a good vocabulary for argumentation and differentiation. It cuts up things into pieces very easily. But still. So this was on the theme of spiritual practices in a multicultural setting. The one of the international director of the Shinyoen asked us to share any suggestions we might give to him on these matters of the difficulty they were facing. So I had one session with him where I shared whatever I had seen of Europe and America. And for one, I said to him, it would be an error for you to look at the whole of Europe as one space. America is much more homogeneous. You go from north to south. Yes, there are differences of accent. Yes, there are differences of mindset also and values, but the differences are not so sharp, whereas Europe is much more diverse. So you have to look at each country separately. And even sometimes within the country, the north and south could be very different. And then he made a very interesting comment. He said, for the new members in Europe, they find often the Catholics come more easily and the Protestants don't come so easily. And I pointed out to him that this has perhaps to do with their own tradition being highly ritualistic. And so the Catholics are used to the ritualism, and so they are able to make that transition more easily, whereas the Protestants have defined themselves by a rejection of ritualism, and so they have a difficulty adapting. So, and I discussed in my own limited experience what I had seen different across several of these countries. But one thing which I said common generally for the modern mind is that you have to first tap them with their understanding, and then only the heart opens, especially with the younger generations. If they understand, if it makes sense rationally, then after that they are okay, they're relaxed, and then they can connect with the heart. But if you first try to connect to the heart and say, you must believe this, you must accept this feels good, oh, I'm wary. Because I've been burnt very often, I've been taught to doubt, to question, to verify, and so there's this whole layer which prevents. I had one very interesting experience many years ago, maybe 10 or 15 now, I don't know. It was in Bangalore in a school where there were about 1,000 children aged 12 to 18. So it was a very wide range. So I took up the theme of science of Indian rituals. Now, this is in a group, in a cultural setting, an English medium school where children often grow up highly Europeanized in their thinking, and often they get disconnected from the values of their grandparents. And one of the forms of that disconnect is that they reject rituals, traditions, ceremonies, and so on. So my objective was to somehow bridge that gap. So I took a whole range of different kinds of practices which are common in the Hindu tradition, and explained what was the rationale behind and what led to those particular forms and the principles which made those forms effective and things like that. It was a very interesting session. We went on for about 2 hours, a lot of questions. A week later, I got a call from the principal of the school, and she said, your talk has had a very strong impact. Parents are phoning us now. So I said, my God, did I do something wrong? She said, no, the parents are phoning us to say that earlier we used to teach the children. Now the children are teaching us how to do it the right way. So I gave this example because I found this to be something very specific to the modern mind, that we first need to understand and then we can accept more easily. So he said, unfortunately, that their own tradition was not so much philosophical, it was much more in the ritual and the practice, but still. So these were some of the highlights of our discussion. That was in Japan. Perhaps I've missed some other things which may come up later. Maybe I'll pause here and we can open to some discussion or any questions. Anybody else wants to share their own experiences? Yes. Yes. The group which is organizing this, it's called Global Peace Initiative of Women, GPIW. So the group is led by women, but they invite men and women from all traditions. So that's not a problem. Yes, yes. The theme of the gathering was this, but we were all invited from different traditions, from the yogic tradition, the Sufi, the Buddhist, the uh, Christian tradition, and the Jewish tradition. I do not know. This time there was nobody from the Native American, but the idea was that we bring people of deep practice, not just scholars, but people who are practitioners. And so the interaction can be based on experience rather than just words. So it was a very good gathering. Yes, of various different traditions. No, the sharing was of the themes which I discussed, some of them. On that basis, each one came from their experience. So each one of these, they are all teachers in their own right, in their own traditions. So they have had experiences dealing with these types of situations and how do they deal with it. So that is what we were sharing. A yogic tradition. I come from the yogic tradition, from the Sri Aurobindo ashram, but the yogic tradition generally. The problem is, this word Aurobindonian, my teacher was very against it. He said when you reduce something like that to a term, you are narrowing it to another facet. Sri Aurobindo was not just another facet. He gave an integral perspective which liberates you from all the facets and unites them. So he disliked this term Aurobindonian. It was a term invented by K.D. Setna because of his philosophical bent of mind. So he had to compare Jungian versus Aurobindonian. So I personally don't like that word at all. Huh. Yeah. So I would use the word integral approach, but even that, in a context like this, it's not like you're trying to take a position in relation to others. So I just say from Sri Aurobindo Ashram. They all know what that means. That's good enough. Yes. The objective of these meetings? It's actually difficult to articulate that because the way I articulate it, there are three objectives here. First is in our meeting together like this, we are learning from each other at a deeper level of our traditions. So when I hear a Sufi speak of what it means for them to connect their inner spiritual experience with their outer life, when I hear from a Buddhist what it means for them, these things are as if a resonance or bring out facets, aspects of the experience which I might be missing or which complete my own experience in a certain way. We are in a way learning from each other at the same time as we are sharing. And so this is one side where there's an individual growth for each person, which we take back to our tradition. Second is the collective growth that takes place in the joining of all these traditions, where at some point suddenly we feel that we are part of a single whole of an emerging, awakening spiritual consciousness. We actually experience that. Although we come from all these different traditions, we feel ourselves part of one family, one spiritual being, one spiritual culture, one spiritual purpose. That experience is extremely important because if that can be realized, experienced in a group like this, it has its repercussion, ripple effect on the world. For example, what Auroville represents, with the same idea, when you can do it in a small group, it has this, and we have felt that it has this effect. And the third is something much more occult. When a person comes from their tradition, representing that tradition in a gathering like this, I believe and I feel that the spirit of that tradition comes through that person, is present in some way. And when we experience this together and connect like this together at a spiritual level, there is a shift that takes place in the spirit of that tradition itself, which impacts innumerable people without even us being fully conscious of it. And this is intended in the larger purpose of this kind of gathering. Yes. Yes, yes. And the intention is of a larger impact in the world. That we want to bring a shift. Through our own little shift here, we want that to ripple out in the world. That if we can experience this together, that we do not see our traditions as conflicting but as actually nourishing each other, then that experience will widen out. It will make its change in others. Yes, so when we are speaking here of change, although they use this phrase transformative practices in a multicultural world. So the idea is of transformation of some kind. But this word evolution, we were told in these gatherings to avoid it because some of the Sufis had a problem with that. So the first time that we had this problem, we decided, all right, we will not use that word since they have a reaction to it. I said, I will use a different word, which will be unfolding, revealing, developing. And they said, we have no problem with those words. So that's fine. And again, it's a question of vocabulary. Because for them, evolution was a problem because science used this word evolution as a way of throwing out God, throwing out spirituality. But again, that's a misunderstanding. It does not need to be like that. But well, it's a small problem. It's not a big deal for us. But the idea is, yes, that it has to lead to a larger transformation of humanity. Yes. See, yes, we did not get into that in this session, but we had something in this direction in some other meetings, speaking of higher levels of cognition. Now, this is a problem which one has to deal with in a different way. I wouldn't want that I present hierarchy of grades of consciousness as something which is in conflict with other traditions. I would rather point out that every tradition has this idea of higher degrees of perception, higher grades of consciousness, in which the whole world is seen now on a new basis. So, if I present it in this way, I do not end up placing these gradations of consciousness in opposition to other traditions. Okay, so that's why the idea here was to relate at the level of experience. And when you speak of it like this, there's no problem. But if I start saying there's higher mind, there's illumined mind, there's intuitive mind, overmind, they'll say, what is this mumbo jumbo? There's nothing in our books which says this or in our tradition, which is not true. They actually have experiences of those things also. Yes. So, yes, this did briefly, I brought this angle when I said that engaging with the world leading to a transformation from a spiritual perspective. But how far should it go? And I said, eventually one would want that all of our instruments, mind, life, body, and our whole social interaction should be a reflection and an expression of the divine consciousness. And it is towards this ideal that we should work, however long it takes. To that extent, we were all in agreement. There is no tradition which says no to that. So if your question is there a conflict on this point? No, we all agree to that. It's only when you put it in certain words that they will say, oh, but no, this is different. If you put it in these words, there's no problem at all. Yes. Perhaps they do. Perhaps they do. I don't know. I think it varies from individual to individual. See, the difference is Sri Aurobindo articulates this straight on as this is the larger goal. Other traditions may not say it in that way, or they may say it in a way that is now very diluted or symbolic. When in the Christian tradition they speak of apocalypse, revelation, kingdom of God, these are meant to point to such a thing. But the way it is now understood perhaps is different. Oh yes, there are some very fine people. That's the reason why all I have across in these meetings organized by the GPIW, I have met some extraordinary beings from each tradition. No exception there. So extraordinary people. They're all people who have been in deep practice for a very long time and have attained to something concrete. Yes, yes, very much. They're all teachers in their own tradition, and they're coming to these gatherings only for that. Otherwise, they would remain in a monastery and not interact at all. No, no. They're all engaged in some action. You see. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yes, yes, yes. There were at least three Muslims this time, maybe four, I'm not sure. So the question is whether they were lay people or they were priests. So there are some traditions where the tradition itself is lay people. So they're all in family and things like that. There's some traditions like that also. But we had one lady who was a Christian, what's the bishop in her lineage. One lady who was a bishop, yes, in her tradition. I don't know, Anglican tradition. Okay, she was herself a bishop. There were two Muslims who were themselves. One of them was a, I don't know whether they call them what they call them, teacher. Yeah, yeah, things like that. We have had in the past others who were sheikhs in their lineage. So Jewish people, yes, there were several Jewish people also. There was one lady and one gentleman. What? I don't think there were any conflicts with this group. See, we have had other sessions in the past. Yes, of course. But these people, remember, they are all coming from a deeper practice. They come from a mystical Judaism, not from a ritualistic only Judaism. So they have already themselves had certain deeper experiences and they have understood other cultures, even experienced things from their tradition. Yes. 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 You see, yes, I agree. I agree. I agree. Yes. So even with these Sufis, we didn't use the word evolution. But we didn't use the word evolution even with the Sufis. Yes. So you know what happens. Also understand the group here is a selection. We are not trying to bring the difficult ones. We try to bring people who have already had some deepening and widening. Otherwise, this would be pointless. There are enough people doing that sort of thing where they sit and talk, read out texts and fight over a few words and commas. It doesn't help. It doesn't change anything. They all go back satisfied that they pushed forward their agenda and their teaching first, and they were superior to other teachings, and that's it. It's not changed anything. But here is the goal is very different. So the people are selected carefully for that. Yes. Different groups have different objectives. There are already enough people doing that kind of work. There are not enough people doing this kind of work. So it is more important to keep our focus on what's important here for us. Yes, yes. Yes. The change, which we also seek, is going to happen at an inner level in the whole collective. So, in these gatherings, there is an intention also that this should impact others. We start, in fact, these gatherings with prayers, each one from their own tradition. They do certain prayers and we meditate together. We, during the discussions, every now and then, when something has been spoken, we pause, we concentrate for half a minute, assimilate, and then move to the next step. So, it's a very meditative atmosphere, and we end with that also. So, the whole space has a different feel. Yes. 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 I believe so. I believe okay, the question is words are very confusing. So in future, will this understanding beyond words become more common? If you look at the way we are evolving increasingly, and Sri Aurobindo called it the subjective age, we're beginning to recognize something deeper behind even our words, and then behind other people's words. And those who are more conscious of it, listening to your words, I try to feel what it is that you are feeling, which makes you say those words. And sometimes, although your words may say something very superficial, I got the message behind, which was never spoken. And if this becomes more and this will become more and more common as humanity moves more into this subjective age. So yes, we will come very quickly to a point where, at least in the higher part of humanity, language will no more be an obstacle. Yes, yes, exactly. Among these people, yes, much less problems. Yes, it will be nice. I will say the question was whether I felt the experience of eternity among any of these people from different traditions. I can say this that I have met people in these meetings, not specifically this one, but in these meetings, in whom I felt that they had touched something of the self or the timeless or the transcendence of some experience. That they have touched that is obvious when they speak certain experiences, when they share certain experiences, or sometimes just when they speak from that state. And this I can say I have met people from each of these traditions, somebody at least like that. Yes, of course. Yes. Yes. See, it's a very important idea that when you touch eternity, it takes away all the anxiety about the crisis. Yes, it takes away the anxiety, but on the other hand, it doesn't prevent you from action and even urgent action. You may not be anxious, but still the urgency does not go away. In eternity, you know that if this humanity fails, where a whole new humanity will be restarted, as has happened many times before on this planet and others, no big deal. But it would be a pity if this opportunity is lost because it means going all over again, and this should not happen. This should not happen. Yes, yes. Yeah, the civilization may not survive, but humanity will survive. Yes, and the earth. That to us, this is the assurance that the mother gave, that Sri Aurobindo's presence on earth brings that certainty that the work will be done. The transition may be painful, it may be long, and that depends on humanity's collaboration or not, but the work will be done. What is the question was if humanity is moving away from that thinking that we will go to another planet because this is destroyed. So, on the one hand, it's obvious we can't just do that. It's obvious we can't just do that. We do not have the means, we do not even know another planet we could go to. That's a different matter. But the idea that you just dump waste and move on comes from a sense of irresponsibility and a lack of connection with the whole. All those individuals and cultures which feel their connection with the whole, they feel the pain that the earth is suffering. And the first thing you do when you feel yourself in pain, your own larger being in pain, your mother in pain, is you reach out to help. So if humanity matures enough, recovers enough this sense of connection, then we would not abandon Mother Earth. We would rather work to heal the damage that we have caused her. And even in a greater maturity, we would ask her, how best can we help? How best can we heal? Because she already has the means. We are the ones who are continuously going against the message that she is giving us. But I believe this we are very close to that point where this will happen. That's of course a personal feeling that we will collectively take responsibility for the earth much more. No, in fact, in this group, because they're all very different people, we have also met a few times. We know that we're meeting on a different level. There's never this tendency of one tradition try to assert itself over another. We all come from the recognition that we each carry with us something of value, and together we complete. And that sense is there very strongly with this group. Remember, these are people selected. And also, most of us have met several times, so there has been a development, a connection. Tina, you had a question. You had, okay. Okay. Perhaps. Why not? Perhaps. Why not? I had in one of these gatherings, there was a lady from Afghanistan who is like a Malala but an adult. This is a lady who, during the Taliban period, was working for the education of women and girls. She was running schools secretly, and even the husbands wouldn't know that their wives were going to school. And they would be told that they're going for cooking classes, and in the cooking classes, they would have their formal education interactions. And she was masterminding all this. And she said to us she had to live every night in a different house because she was afraid anytime the Taliban would kill her. So, this is extraordinary woman. And in the interaction we had, she had brought a group of young people from Afghanistan, and we met in Dharamshala and in the center of Buddhism there. And they went to a Buddhist monastery and they saw these young Buddhists sitting and learning by rote, swinging their body as they chant, no, 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 no. And these were also formally educated in Islam and Quran. They said, that's exactly like us. We also do this. Anyway, but so we had an interaction with her, and I had given her some material of integral education, some videos, and some books, and she was very thrilled. She wanted somebody to come there and train her teachers in this way. I didn't have the courage to go to Afghanistan, but it's, yes. Mhm. Yes, yes, exactly. This was, in fact, the yes, yes. See, on the question of influencing these events, this was, in fact, the objective of these gatherings, being being held at places of conflict. They were deliberately held in places of conflict so that we may bring something different for a change. That was the idea. So we have even had similar gatherings and the places when they had the UN G8 meeting and UN Climate Summit. So we've had gatherings there also outside the UN main meeting, but within their premises to try to bring a different consciousness to change influence these leaders with something of a higher vision. Of course, they are too hardened to be influenced easily, but still it makes a difference. It has an impact for sure. Yes, yes, yes. In fact, they had one of their earliest gatherings was in Palestine. I was not present at that time. I didn't know this group. No, I was not. I didn't know this group then. But they had similarly, but we couldn't. They couldn't go to Iraq. But they had a group from Iraq come to India, a group from Afghanistan coming to India. We had three gatherings in Srinagar, Sufi Yogi Dialogue. It was called. So the idea was to, and then bringing people from across from Pakistan and from India together. Middle East, yes. In Bahrain, we had small things like that. The idea was precisely to bring a shift there. This particular group, the question was where do they stand in relation to the Divine Mother? So this particular group, GPIW, they were the first to bring in these two dimensions into interfaith dialogue. First, what they call the Divine Feminine, by which they mean the Divine Mother, but it has to use a kind of a new agey word because it's an American group. So still, the other is, and of it's more neutral. If you say Divine Mother, in certain traditions, it'll raise their hackles. If you say Divine Feminine, oh, that's not a problem. But on the other side, they also brought this idea of the connection with the earth, nature, and the environment. So, in so far, all the interfaith discussions that had been going on, they were all about limitation to belief systems and religions. But these are two dimensions which this group brought for the first time. And as a result, interestingly, this over the last 5 years has rippled out. Other interfaith groups now are raising these issues and discussing these themes. So it has been pioneering in its work. And the founder of this group, Dina Merriam, was recently awarded this Niwano Peace Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize for interfaith peace work. It's as a recognition of this change that she was able to bring. Mhm. It's more complex. Just because there is a conflict or a catastrophe somewhere does not necessarily mean what it seems. Very often, in among human beings, we do not make an effort to progress unless we face danger and problems. And sometimes the supramental power may use these situations to help people to wake up, if that's the only way left. The way the supramental consciousness is working is to lead to the most rapid growth with the least damage. And that combination is a very tricky combination. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. In one of the meetings, there was a very uh, strong Buddhist activist coming from a very nirvanic emptiness teaching. And having been to two or three discussions where we this divine feminine and nature and Mother Earth and connection with the environment, all that had come up, and he felt very deeply connected with that. In one of the sessions, he said, with a lot of enthusiasm, he said, "We must celebrate the divine feminine." So we were all observing, let's say, in amusement, that it has changed all of us who have been part of these discussions. We have grown in ways that is, we have outgrown the limitations of our traditions. That's why we could speak of even widening our own traditions. That idea otherwise will be anathema in any orthodox system. What Mother spoke of, that we have to go beyond religion. I'm seeing how that can happen from within the religious system in these meetings. Beyond religion does not mean you abandon everything and then jump into some confusion of new age fantasy mix of it is obviously using what you have as a support, but then going beyond the limitations of this system or structure which has helped you. In fact, in the early Sufi Yogi dialogue, they wanted to organize it in Oroville. And unfortunately, the person they spoke to was a bit, let's say, limited. And she said, "Oh, but Mother said we have to go beyond religion. And you're going to talk about religion here? No, we don't want it." But exactly the point was we were going to go beyond religion, exactly. And this would have been a perfect place for that. So then we shifted it to Rishikesh first. Yes, perhaps. Maybe we'll talk later. But I've seen each of these persons, especially as we have evolved over a few years, over these sessions, and I can see how there's such a deep respect for each other's traditions, but also there is a freedom from orthodoxy of the tradition itself. Mhm. Yes. Mm. In another discussion that the mother had in, I think, the agenda, she said when that's not that the religion, the teaching of the religion will fall away, but the power that the religion has over the minds of people to homogenize and force them into a fixed system of thinking, that will go. And then you have each religion you can see has so much to share among its teaching. That remains. There's one thing which was to me personally enlightening. This was from, I learned something from an American Swami of the Ramakrishna order. This is Swami Atmarupananda, who at the age of 18 joined the Ramakrishna mission in San Francisco and has been a monk since then. Today he's probably in his 60s. And is somebody I have always had a deep respect for. Comes with a lot of depths of insight and experience. He's currently editing the writings of Swami Vivekananda for the new collected works they're working on. They've gone through similar problems of people wanting to change and improve his language and all that. So he just wants to go back to what was originally written. So, because he was born in a Christian tradition and then he moved to the Vedantic tradition, and obviously there's a past life connection with Swami Vivekananda where he must have been even in present physically in that life. He has a remembrance, a very clear remembrance of a life before that in China. So he found in this life he could pick up Chinese just like that. But so because he came from the Christian tradition and then he went through a transition into the Vedantic learning, he shared with me something very important because we were speaking of this mindset thing. He explained to me what happens for those who grow up in the orthodoxy of the Christian tradition and why it's hard for them to see things in a certain way. So he shared what happened to him. It was at some point that he was staying in a monastery for an interfaith discussion in the Snowmass monastery. And after 3 days, suddenly he felt something suffocating and then it just broke. And he knew he was free of that mindset. And it's only when he was on the other side that he could look back and understand. And he explained to me like this. He said that because the church has been hammering away this idea of sin, that we are born of sin and there is this whole idea of guilt, and you have to feel bad, you have to feel guilty, you have to feel inferior, you have to feel incapable. This leaves a very deep imprint. You always feel somehow that you are dirty, filthy, sinful. And second, even in your emergence from, first of all, second thing in this is you cannot pull yourself out of it. You need an external agency to come and pull you out, which in this case then becomes Christ. Third, even after you're pulled out of it, you are still separate from the divine. You grow to a certain point and you stop, and that division from the divine, it still remains. And this goes so deep, he said, that in many of their monasteries, some of their teachers said, people come there weeping and say, Swamiji, I'm so bad, I'm so horrible, I'm so sinful. And he says, but what's the problem? Have you committed a murder? No. Have you harmed somebody? Have you stolen something? Have you? No, no, no. Then what is it that's bad? Oh, you don't know how bad I am inside, and things like that. And this idea of I am not good enough and I am dirty somehow goes very deep. And it takes a long time to get free of that. Whereas in the Vedantic approach, the starting point is we are essentially pure and divine. What prevents us from recognizing it is veils of ignorance. And we have the power to remove those veils. We do not need an external agency to do it for us. And when finally all the veils are removed, we are one with the source, we are one with the divine. And this is the polar opposite of these. These are the 3 points on which the two mindsets clash. So it came up because in one of the discussions there was somebody kept insisting about be this idea of repentance, and that's why this discussion we had of the main discussion in the sidelines. He explained to me this difference. For me, it was a very revealing uh, sharing. Then he told me, I will also explain to you the difference between the Buddhist mindset and the Vedantic. But we didn't have time for that. So next time I meet, yes, it's something which is worth understanding. But it shows you how, especially when there is a strong entrenched orthodoxy in the religion, it can go very deep. and it can be difficult to even free oneself from that. Hmm. Yes, yes, yes. Exactly, exactly. Yes. Sri Aurobindo has an interesting aphorism that originally the cross represented the union of the individual with the universal. And because of the current situation in humanity, his used specific words, I don't remember, it has come to represent suffering. Yes, 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 exactly. Yes. Um, yes, 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 yes. Yes. So what he was speaking was very specific to Catholic Church, very specific to that. Yes. Maybe you're okay. Exactly. Yes. 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 See, this is where you see the difference in culture. The same religion takes on different forms in different cultures because of the cultural values that you grew up in. This imprint may not be so strong at all, or it may not be there at all. Yes, yes. Mhm, mhm. Yes. Mhm. Interesting. Yes. 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 You were fortunate. You were fortunate. He made one more comment. What was the point of this discussion was he said, those who come from an atheistic background find it much more easy to atheist, atheist without religion. They find it much more easy to move into a freer perspective. And it made me understand why the mother had taken birth also in an atheist uh, family. And many people that we know, they started with that and then they opened to something. That passage is much easier than being deep in orthodoxy in a certain system and then trying to come out of it. Very well. Yes. Yes. Mm. Mhm. Yes. Yes. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Yes. Yes. Interesting. Yeah. We are surely passing through very interesting times because all these things are changing so fast before our eyes. We don't have to wait centuries to see them change. It's happening within years. We can end with a chant of Om. We will continue the main text which we have been studying from the 26th of December. Next week again I will have to be out. And that's why I didn't want to get into the text today. Not this Sunday, but it'll be after 28th we will have the class. Om.